Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can take a look at the Steven Avery case in terms of personality, mental health, behavioral components. This case was made popular by the Making a Murder series. Now, of course, Steven Avery and the other people I'll be talking about in this video are real people. So just a reminder that I'm not making any diagnosis, rather just speculating on what could be happening in a case like this. So Steven Avery is a convicted murderer, as I mentioned, made popular by this documentary series. And the case is extremely complex. So I'm going to give a summary here, but it is important to note that there's a massive amount of information available on this case, because really it spans all the way from 1985 till the present. So as I mentioned, Steven Avery is a convicted murderer. He was a resident of Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. He was born in 1962. His family owns and operates a salvage yard, and that's where he grew up. He was shown to be a fairly poor student growing up, and it's alleged his IQ is around 70, which is 2 standard deviations below the mean. So to put that in perspective in terms of his percentile rank, if his IQ is indeed 70, he would be at about the 2nd percentile. That means that about 98% of the population would have an IQ higher than Steven Avery. Now we know in his early years he did have some difficulties with the law, and I'll look at that a little later on in the video when I look at the evidence that points toward guilt and points toward innocence in this case. Now, as I mentioned, this all starts in 1985, and this is a really complex timeline because we're really talking about 2 separate events here. So in 1985, a woman was assaulted in Manitowoc County on the beach on Lake Michigan. And Avery had an alibi during the time that this assault was taking place, yet he was still arrested and convicted. And involved in this was kind of a suspicious police sketch and some animosity that appears that the police department may have had toward Steven Avery. So as I mentioned, he was convicted and he was sentenced to prison. While in prison in 2002, new DNA testing became available and a new suspect was identified by his lawyers based on this DNA testing. They were trying to exonerate Avery. The new suspect was named Gregory Allen. Allen had assaulted someone on that same beach, that Lake Michigan beach, in 1983, and was under police surveillance because they were worried he would commit a crime against a woman. So he was kind of a good suspect for this 1985 assault. However, in 1985, Allen was never a suspect, and that victim never saw him in a lineup. Also, Allen and Avery kind of looked alike. So there were a few reasons here why Avery was convicted. It wasn't necessarily all like a conspiracy or the police having something against him. There was this similarity in terms of appearance. But either way, it appears that Allen was responsible for the 1985 assault, but he was already in prison for another assault by the time we get to 2002. So Avery was exonerated and released from prison in 2003, and he started a civil suit against the county and the district attorney at the time he was convicted, and this civil suit was for $36 million. Now moving to 2005, this civil suit is going on. It's not settled, but it's ongoing. We see that a photographer for Auto Trader, 25-year-old Teresa Halbach, goes missing, and her last appointment was at the Avery salvage yard. She was there to take a picture of a vehicle that Avery wanted to sell for his sister. At least that's what was said by Steven Avery. Now, Avery, of course, became a suspect right away, and we see quite a bit of physical evidence that was collected, and this confession from Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey. And in 2007, we see that Avery was convicted of murder, possession of a firearm, because he was a felon, he wasn't allowed to have a firearm. But he was acquitted for another crime, mutilation of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, based on his confession. He is eligible for parole in 2048. We see that in 2019, Avery wins an appeal, and that's going on now, that moves his case back to the circuit court, and this could result in him getting a new trial or having his conviction thrown out altogether. Now we also see that Brendan Dassey has made several appeals, but all his appeals so far have failed. So now I'll take a look at some of the factors that I think kind of point toward guilt, some that point toward innocence, and then give my thoughts on this case in terms of Steven Avery and whether he did it or not. Of course I don't know, but I'll give my thoughts on it. So this part of the video kind of unpacks some of the details in this case. As I mentioned, it's enormously complex, and I really just gave an extremely short summary earlier here in the video. So we move toward the factors that indicate guilt, that make Steven Avery appear more guilty. The first part would be his criminal history. I mentioned he had a criminal history. He had a history of burglary. He also had these charges stemming from killing a cat. He was with friends and they had a fire going, and allegedly he poured gasoline on this cat and put the cat on the fire. So a really disturbing crime, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Also, we see that he ran his cousin off the road. They were both in motor vehicles, ran off the road and got out and pointed a firearm at her. So we have three offenses here. The burglary, it could be argued how serious that is, but certainly killing the cat serious, and this incident with the cousin. Now we also see a number of other allegations towards Steven Avery that weren't necessarily supported like in a court of law, but a number of these allegations have to do with domestic violence. Now in terms of that incident where he kills the cat, this is why I think this really points toward guilt. Obviously it's a criminal charge, so that doesn't look good, but also this is consistent with a personality construct called psychopathy. Now again, I'm not diagnosing Avery. I've never met him. I don't have any direct information about him, just this evidence we see, like on the internet and on this documentary series. But either way, we see here that this type of behavior in general is consistent with psychopathy. And with psychopathy, we see characteristics like being cold and distant, being manipulative, having a lack of empathy, engaging in criminal activity, and having sensation-seeking characteristics. So being bored easily and looking for kind of thrills, looking for action. One of the key indicators of psychopathy, one of the elements that we believe predicts psychopathy later in life, is when somebody kills or tortures an animal earlier in life. So again, as I mentioned, this is consistent with psychopathy. We also see that in prison, he allegedly told somebody that he wanted to assault and kill women. So that doesn't look too good for him either. Now moving to the facts more specific to the Teresa Halbach murder, we see that he may have lured Teresa Halbach onto his property. He used the *67 feature with his phone to hide his number when he tried to call her a few times, and apparently wanted her to come out to take these pictures. And what I mean by this is he wanted her specifically to come out and take these pictures, not just anybody who took pictures for Auto Trader. Teresa also had a prior unpleasant experience with Steven Avery. Apparently he was wearing nothing but a towel when he answered the door, and she had a bad feeling about him. So this doesn't look too good for Steven. We also see that Halbach's Toyota RAV4 was found on Avery's property in the salvage yard, so near where his residence was. In that vehicle, Avery's blood was found. Also his DNA was found on the hood latch, and the battery cables were disconnected. So somebody went under the hood and removed the battery cables from the battery. We also see that the key to the vehicle was found in Avery's residence, and his DNA was on that key. Now, of course, the key is also used here as a feature to demonstrate his innocence, but I'll talk about that when I'm talking about factors that point toward innocence. Now, next to Steven Avery's residence, we see there's a garage. Bone fragments and teeth from Teresa Halbach were found in a fire pit behind that garage. We also see that Teresa's personal items, like her cell phone and a camera, were found burned in a barrel on that property. Additionally, in that garage, we see that a bullet was found, and this bullet had Teresa's DNA on it and matched a weapon that Avery had access to. And again, Avery was not allowed to have access to weapons, to firearms, because he was a convicted felon. Now, I mentioned before briefly the situation with Brandon Dassey. This was Steven Avery's nephew who confessed to the crime. This confession, even though it was later recanted, of course, does seem to point toward Steven Avery's guilt. Dassey said that he helped Avery murder Teresa and hide her body. So this didn't look good for Steven Avery. Now, there's some other pieces as well, but I think I've covered most of the major pieces of evidence that point toward guilt. Now, looking at some of the factors that point toward innocence. Well, here with these factors, we see a number of factors that kind of indicate that Steven Avery may not have been the one who murdered Teresa Halbach. Avery was in the middle of a massive lawsuit, civil lawsuit, against the county, Manitowoc County, and against the district attorney who was in office at the time when Avery was wrongly convicted. So, an interesting aspect of this, the insurance company, the county's insurance company, was not going to pay a claim if Avery won. So this means that the county would have to pay the claim, and some of the individuals who are accused of wrongdoing may have been personally liable. And of course, those individuals were members of law enforcement. So this is important to keep in mind when thinking about the factors that point toward innocence. Avery appears to have been really the only suspect the police looked at in this case. Nobody else was really seriously investigated. Also, from the very beginning, Avery was a suspect. So we see the police kind of lock on to Avery and don't really appear to look at anybody else. Avery's property was searched repeatedly and extensively, with these new discoveries like the key and the bullet being made after all these searches took place. So after all of these other searches ostensibly missed this evidence. So it doesn't really make sense how this evidence was missed this many times. It's one thing to find evidence on a second search, but we see many searches occurred here of his property. We also see that officers, and these are Manitowoc County Sheriff deputies, who had been deposed recently in the lawsuit, volunteered to search Avery's residence. And they found this key, which of course becomes a major piece of evidence pointing toward his guilt. And of course this key was missed on several prior searches. Again, just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Now, kind of building on this, it seems like these Manitowoc County deputies just couldn't seem to stay away from this case. They just couldn't be uninvolved. It was an obvious conflict of interest. Even with the officers searching the residence and finding the key, there was an officer from another police department in there with them who was supposed to keep an eye on them. So, if there was this level of awareness about the conflict of interest, why did they involve themselves at all? It looks really suspicious. And, again, it's a factor that points toward innocence in this case. Now, something else interesting related to the civil suit. Some allege that Avery's arrest really kind of pushed him to settle that case because he didn't have enough money to pay for a defense. Public defenders certainly would not have done a good job for Avery in this instance. He did end up settling the case for $400,000, not $36 million. Now, if this case had not been brought forward, one would think that maybe he would have settled this wrongful conviction suit for several million, maybe not $36 million, but still several $1 million, not $400,000. Still, we see others that say no, they dispute this, and say that he settled it for $400,000 because that's the most he could have received. Right? That was a good settlement for him. So we see two different theories here, but still, this civil suit was ongoing at the time of this investigation, and it just doesn't look good. It looks suspicious. Other factors to consider here: the vehicle of Teresa Halbach was found on the Avery salvage yard property. This vehicle was located by a volunteer, and she located it in under an hour from when she started searching. This property was 40 acres. There were cars everywhere, vehicles everywhere. She also just happened to have a direct number to the sheriff. Now, when she testifies, she kind of indicates that she believed that she found the vehicle through divine intervention. Now, I believe divine intervention occurs, but this is not something we'd usually see in a court case. Like, we don't use divine intervention to explain why people find things when really it doesn't seem like they should have found them, in terms of like statistics and probability. So I think this actually points toward Steven Avery's innocence. We also see that a vial of blood that was taken when he was incarcerated before from the 1985 case looks like it was tampered with. The package was unsealed, and we see that there's a hole in the top of the vial. Now, this was explained in his trial. There was somebody who indicated that they used a hypodermic needle and punctured it. So there was some explanation for this, but still, this doesn't look good. And the last element that I'll mention here that points toward innocence is the confession of Brendan Dassey, right? He was young. Evidently, he also had a fairly low IQ, again, rumored to be around 70. And if you look at the confession, the video is available for this, and it was included, partially at least, in this documentary I mentioned before. It does really look coerced. There have been different rulings on this. Right now, as I mentioned, he has not been successful in appeals, but there was a favorable ruling for him before that was undone later on by another ruling. But either way, this confession really does appear to be coerced. We see that the officers are giving him ideas, almost like he didn't really know what to say, and they are kind of telling him what to say. Now, there are other bits of information in that confession that he produced where it does seem like he would have had to have been involved in the murder to know that information, but still, the police were really pressing. He was 16 at the time, I believe, and again, we have that low IQ potentially at work. So this is really, I think, something that points toward innocence. I think this confession kind of works against the police department and in a way works for Steven Avery. So what are my thoughts on this case? What's my analysis of the Steven Avery case? We know that many people have been influenced pretty strongly by the Making a Murderer series, and it's really quite convincing. When you watch the first season, the first 10 episodes, you kind of leave thinking that Steven Avery must be innocent. So beyond just not guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, but innocent. Well, I think it's important to look at all the evidence. The documentary series, I think, is pretty good, but it does leave out some important elements. It seems to include everything that pointed toward innocence, and it fails to include some of the things that pointed toward guilt. Right? The way the testimony was kind of featured in the documentary, it wasn't complete. They didn't really have everything there, and the order seemed to be changed around in terms of what really happened in the trial. But either way, we see that, as I indicated, not guilty is different than innocent, right? So not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard that Steven Avery was judged by in that trial, is different than being truly innocent, right? They're different constructs. So if one is to believe that the police planted the key in this case, right? Here are my thoughts on this. If someone's to believe that they planted the key, that they were capable of something like that they were motivated strongly enough to do that, then seemingly all of the other evidence really doesn't seem to matter a lot, because who knows what else they did, right? The investigation gets tainted at that point. Now, I've seen this argument before that says the police planted the key, but they couldn't have planted the other evidence. But again, once the investigation is tainted, I believe that alone is reasonable doubt. Right? So in terms of, is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? No, I don't think so. Because that whole issue with the key just seems so suspicious, and you only need one reasonable doubt for someone to be not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So for me, this is actually enough to say, in my opinion anyway, I believe he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I've also seen the argument that the police believed he was guilty, and that he was actually guilty, and they just wanted to make sure he was found guilty. But I think this is the same problem, a bad investigation. Maybe Avery was a good suspect, but what if somebody else was a better suspect? We'll never know, because the police didn't follow up. They didn't check out other suspects, at least not to any serious degree. So we'll never know if the other suspects had a motive, opportunity, what evidence might be involved that connects them. We'll never really see any of that. We only see what Avery's potential involvement was. So we just get this one side of the picture. Now, again, I indicated reasonable doubt's different than innocence. So, do I believe he's innocent? Well, this gets a little trickier, right? Because this isn't a matter of like an opinion based on the standard that a court would use, but rather just thinking about the evidence, what they call preponderance of evidence. Well, for the first time Avery was accused, I'm talking about the 1985 assault, I do believe he was innocent there. It makes sense that Gregory Allen committed that crime. I don't know if Allen did, but it just makes sense that he would have been a much better suspect there. Now, I think really with this 1985 case, what we have with Steven Avery is more than just him being innocent, but rather a horrible miscarriage of justice. I think here he was wronged. I think that the police really did some horrendous acts to get him wrongly convicted. I don't think there's really any getting around that. The police still maintain, some of them, that they think he may have committed that crime, which just seems so ridiculous when given the evidence that exonerated him. Now, moving to the 2005 murder of Teresa Halbach, this is a lot different. Here he seems like the logical suspect. He had the means, opportunity, a history consistent with violence, although he didn't have a history, of course, of murder. And one would have to overlook a substantial amount of evidence, or one would have to believe that the police framed him in order to believe he was innocent. So with this case, the 2005 case, I just don't know. I would probably lean toward the simplest answer is usually the correct answer, Occam's razor here, which would point toward Avery being guilty. The logic here is someone had to do it, and most of the evidence points toward Avery. But at the same time, it's not unthinkable that one or two police officers could have done something wrong here and could have framed Steven Avery. It's not that most police officers are corrupt. We know the evidence actually supports that most are honest and do a good job. They're as honest as the general population anyway. But in my clinical experience working with clients who have had a lot of interactions with law enforcement, working with law enforcement directly, working with the friends and family of clients who've been involved with the criminal justice system, even though I would still say that most of the interactions are positive, we do see some trends that could support this theory in the Steven Avery case that the police framed him. For one thing, I've seen that mental health and the law don't mix well together, and that would connect to this case if one were to believe that Avery had mental health issues or extreme personality characteristics. Now, I don't know if he did or he does, but either way, if one were to believe that, mental health and the law do not mix well together. And the concern here is that law enforcement are usually considered a tight-knit group, and even normally good officers might overlook the bad acts of other officers because they want to demonstrate their loyalty, or they believe that a suspect is really guilty, so they're not doing anything wrong by making that suspect look more guilty, right? And I've seen this a few times. They don't want to be made an outsider either, right? An officer who's a good officer, when approached by a bad officer, that good officer wants to be a member of the team. They want to play along, so they get tempted to behave in a way that would be criminal. Again, many members of law enforcement tend to stick together, and their unwillingness to get out of this case with Steven Avery just doesn't look good. I mentioned that before. So, again, I don't know if he did it or not. I lean a little bit toward the idea that he did do it, but there are a lot of factors here that point the other direction too. As with all cases kind of similar to this is a tragedy either way, right? There was a horrible murder committed here. That's a tragedy. And maybe Steven Avery is sitting in prison and he's not guilty. Who knows? But this is a tragic situation. This is certainly one of the most interesting cases that I've seen in examining a lot of cases over the years. We have someone here who's wrongly accused, convicted, then exonerated, then arrested again, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. So certainly, again, an interesting case and an unusual case, to say the least. So I know whenever I talk about cases like this, in particular, the cases that are really controversial, and certainly this case qualifies as a controversial case, I know that there are going to be different opinions, people who agree or disagree with me, who have other opinions about this case. Please put those opinions in the comments. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this analysis of the Steven Avery case to be interesting. Thanks for watching.